recently, but people have known about atoms for a long time, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
if atoms are so small, how do we know anything about them?
Anything about them. Well, what had to happen is because we don't have instruments to actually look at atoms, we had to come up with models.
Hmm.
Okay, now if you know what a model is something that describes observations that you've made in nature, but it's not really something that you've actually seen yourself.
So who are these guys that made these models?
Well, the first model came like way back in ancient Greece. And way back in ancient Greece, they said, well, gee, all matter can be broken into little pieces,
Right. So
cut up in little pieces and tiny, tiny little pieces. And what the ancient Greeks thought is that the atom then is that very last piece that I can't break down any further.
okay.
So guess what the word they use? Atomus. And
Okay.
atomus is not to be cut. If you want to translate that, it means not to be cut. You can't cut it down any further. So
I got that.
atomus.
But we know more about atoms than that, right? So I mean, how do we
Well,
know?
guess what? So that's ancient Greece. It took like 2,000 years before any other scientists came along to actually demonstrate a model,
So
come up with
2,000
new
years.
models.
Wow.
2,000 years
Huh.
later. And that was a guy named Dalton. So you guys are going to have to get down Dalton.
Dalton. Okay, I'll hold this here so we'll
Okay.
know that while we have Dalton on the screen that we're talking about Dalton.
Yeah, that's Dalton. And now Dalton is the scientist, and I'm going to show you a picture of him. How about I do that? So Dalton is a scientist that looked at the atom as, again, something that's indivisible. You can't break it down any further into smaller particles. It's
Right.
the smallest particle. And that any atom of the same element is going to be exactly alike. Okay, so if you have an element of carbon, all the atoms in carbon are going to be identical.
Oh, I see. Okay, so if you have a carbon from an apple or a carbon from some peanut butter, it doesn't matter. Carbon is carbon no matter where you find it.
And that's what Dalton would say.
Okay, so that's Dalton.
Okay, and Dalton said that that atoms can also form unions with other atoms or join up with other atoms to make compounds.
Okay, so if you have like one atom of one kind and another atom of another, so a little bit of carbon and a little bit of oxygen, they can get together and make a compound.
Yes.
So Dalton, he's the guy who figured that out.
That's Dalton.
Okay.
So after Dalton was the next scientist, and he came around in the late 1800s, and his name was J.J. Thomson.
Let's take a look at him. Wow, he's a funny looking dude. He's got glasses too, huh?
Okay, and he was an English scientist, and he came up with what's commonly called the plum pudding model.
Plum pudding.
The plum pudding model. Okay, so he came up with the idea that atoms are, yes, indivisible, but guess what? The atoms are made up of even smaller particles now.
Okay, so atoms. I thought atoms were in like they were the smallest thing you could have.
Right. Exactly. That's what Dalton thought.
Right.
So what Thomson came up with is he found out that there was some kind of negative charge inside of things. So plum pudding is where the atom is mostly made up of positiveness, but scattered within it is going to be equal amounts of negativeness.
So it's one thing like a cup of pudding, but there's some parts of it that are plum and some parts that are pudding. So that's why he's calling it plum pudding.
Yeah, the
Okay,
plum pudding
I got
model.
it. So
Okay.
the little raisins or the plums, they're like the electrons, and the rest of the pudding is kind of like the positive protons and neutrons and all
Right.
that.
So he was the
Okay.
first guy that actually came up with the idea of the electron.
Oh, okay.
Thomson.
Thomson.
Okay? Now, if I'd like you to take a look at the next video that we have in here because Thomson had some really cool ideas, and the next scientist that came along wanted to really look at those ideas and see how true they were.
Who is
Okay?
it?
His name is, take a look. And Rutherford
That's how you spell it.
Rutherford came up with the idea that there's an atom with a nucleus inside. I got a little marble here. So there's a nucleus inside, and if you shot little tinier particles at that eventually some of them would bounce back
Okay.
because of that dense nucleus inside. Positively charged nucleus of the atom.
All right.
That's Rutherford. There's one more guy. His name is Bohr. Not to say that he's boring,
Right.
but take a look at him though. You might think he is boring.